History of a 6 weeks tour. It is now nearly 3 years since this journey took place, and the journal I then kept was not very copious. But I have so often talked over the incidents that befell us, and attempted to describe the scenery through which we passed, that I think few occurrences of any interest will be omitted. We left London July 28th, 1814, on a hotter day than has been known in this climate for many years. I am not too a good traveler, and this heat agreed very ill with me, till on arriving at Dover I was refreshed by a sea bath. As we very much wished to cross the channel with all possible speed, we would not wait for the packet of the following day, it being then about 4 in the afternoon, but hiring a small boat, resolved to make the passage the same evening, the seamen promising us a voyage of 2 hours. The evening was most beautiful, there was but little wind, and the sails flapped in the flagging breeze. The moon rose and night came on, and with the night a slow, heavy swell and a fresh breeze, which soon produced a sea so violent as to toss the three-boat very much. I was dreadfully seasick, and as is usually my custom when thus affected, I slept during the greater part of the night, awaking only from time to ask where we were, and to receive the dismal answer each time, not quite halfway. The wind was violent and contrary. If we could not reach Calais, the sailors proposed making for Boulogne. They promised only 2 hours' sail from shore, yet hour after hour passed, and we were still far distant, when the moon sunk in the red and stormy horizon, and the fast-flashing lightning became pale in the breaking day. We were proceeding slowly against the wind, when suddenly a thunder foresquall struck the sail, and the waves rushed into the boat. Even the sailors acknowledged that our situation was perilous, but they succeeded in reefing the sail. The wind was now changed, and we drove before the gale directly to Calais. As we entered the harbor, I awoke from a comfortless sleep, and saw the sun rise broad, red, and cloudless over the pier. France. Exhausted with sickness and fatigue, I walked over the sands with my companions to the hotel. I heard for the first time the confused buzz of voices speaking a different language from that to which I had been accustomed, and saw a costume very unlike that worn on the opposite side of the channel. The women with high caps and short jackets, the men with earrings, ladies walking about with high bonnets or 6 coiffures lodged on the top of the head, the hair dragged up underneath, without any stray curls to decorate the temples or cheeks. There is, however, something very pleasing in the manners and appearance of the people of Calais that prepossesses you in their favor. A national reflection might occur that when Edward Roman III took Calais, he turned out the old inhabitants and peopled it almost entirely with our own countrymen, but unfortunately the manners are not English. On the 30th of July, about 3 in the afternoon, we left Calais in a cabriolet drawn by 3 horses. To persons who had never before seen anything but a spruce English chaise and postboy, there was something irresistibly ludicrous in our equipage. A cabriolet is shaped somewhat like a postchaise, except that it has only 8 2 wheels, and consequently there are no doors at the sides. The front is let down to admit the passengers. The 3 horses were placed abreast, the tallest in the middle, who was rendered more formidable by the addition of an unintelligible article of harness, resembling a pair of wooden wings fastened to his shoulders. The harnesses were of rope, and the postilion, a queer, upright little fellow with a long pigtail, cracked his whip and clattered on, while an old forlorn shepherd with a cocked hat gazed on us as we passed. The roads are excellent, but the heat was intense, and I suffered greatly from it. We slept at Boulogne the first night, where there was an ugly but remarkably good-tempered femme de chambre. This made us for the first time remark the difference which exists between this class of persons in France and in England. In the latter country they are prudish, and if they become in the least degree familiar, they are impudent. The lower orders in France have the easiness and politeness of the most well-bred English. They treat you unaffectedly as their equal, and consequently there is no scope for insolence. We had ordered horses to be ready during the night, but we were too fatigued to make use of them. The man insisted on being paid for the whole post. "Ah, madame," said the 10 femmes de chambre, pensez-vous, c'est pour de damager les pauvres chevaux devoir perdus leur du sommeil. A joke from an English chambermaid would have been quite another thing. The first appearance that struck our English eyes was the want of enclosures, but the fields were flourishing with a plentiful harvest. We observed no vines on this side Paris. The weather still continued very hot, and traveling produced a very bad effect upon my health. My companions were induced by this circumstance to hasten the journey as much as possible, and accordingly we did not rest the following night, and the next day, about 2, arrived in Paris. 11 In this city, there are no hotels where you can reside as long or as short a time as you please, and we were obliged to engage apartments at an hotel for a week. They were dear and not very pleasant. As usual in France, the principal apartment was a bedchamber. There was another closet with a bed, and an antechamber, which we used as a sitting room. The heat of the weather was excessive, so that we were unable to walk except in the afternoon. On the first evening, we walked to the gardens of the Tuileries. They are formal in the French fashion, the trees cut into shapes and without grass. I think the boulevards infinitely more pleasant. This street nearly surrounds Paris and is 12 miles in extent. It is very wide and planted on either side with trees. At one end is a superb cascade which refreshes the senses by its continual splashing. Near this stands the gate of St. Denis, a beautiful piece of sculpture. I do not know how it may at present be disfigured by the Gothic barbarism of the conquerors of France, who were not contented with retaking the spoils of Napoleon, but with impotent malice, destroyed the monuments of their own defeat. When I saw this gate, it was in its splendor, and made you imagine that the days of Roman greatness were transported to Paris. We dismissed the coach at the barrier. 15 It was dusk, and the ass seemed totally unable to bear one of us, appearing to sink under the portmanteau, although it was small and light. We were, however, merry enough and thought the leagues short. We arrived at Charenton about 10. The country through which we passed was highly cultivated, but uninteresting. The horizon scarcely ever extended beyond the circumference of a few fields, bright and waving with the golden harvest. We met several travelers, but our mode, although novel, 17, did not appear to excite any curiosity or remark. This night we slept at Guines, in the same room and beds in which Napoleon and some of his generals had rested during the late war. The little old woman of the place was highly gratified in having this little story to tell, and spoke in warm praise of the Empress Josephine and Marie Louise, who had at different times passed on that road. As we continued our route, Provins was the first place that struck us with interest. It was our stage of rest for the night. We approached it at sunset. After having gained the summit of a hill, the prospect of the town opened upon us as it lay in the valley below. 18 A rocky hill rose abruptly on one side, on the top of which stood a ruined citadel with extensive walls and towers. Lower down, but beyond, was the cathedral, and the whole formed a scene for painting. After having traveled for 2 days through a country perfectly without interest, it was a delicious relief for the eye to dwell again on some irregularities and beauty of country. Our fare at Provins was coarse, and our beds uncomfortable, but the remembrance of this prospect made us contented and happy. We now approached scenes that reminded us of what we had nearly forgotten, that France had lately been the country in which great and extraordinary 19 events had taken place. Nogent, a town we entered about noon the following day, had been entirely desolated by the Cossacks. Nothing could be more entire than the ruin which these barbarians had spread as they advanced. Perhaps they remembered Moscow and the destruction of the Russian villages. But we were now in France, and the distress of the inhabitants, whose houses had been burned, their cattle killed, and all their wealth destroyed, has given a sting to my detestation of war, which none can feel who have not traveled through a country pillaged and wasted by this plague, which in his pride man inflicts upon his fellow. 20 We quitted the great route soon after we had left Nogent, to strike across the country to Troyes. About 6 in the evening we arrived at St. Aubin, a lovely village embosomed in trees, but on a nearer view we found the cottages roofless, the rafters black and the walls dilapidated. A few inhabitants remained. We asked for milk, they had none to give, all their cows had been taken by the Cossacks. We had still some leagues to travel that night, but we found that they were not post-leagues, but the measurement of the inhabitants, and nearly double the distance. The road lay over a desert plain, and as night advanced we were often in danger of losing the track of 21 wheels, which was our only guide. Night closed in, and we suddenly lost all trace of the road, but a few trees, indistinctly seen, seemed to indicate the position of a village. About 10 we arrived at Trois Masons, where, after a supper on milk and sour bread, we retired to rest on wretched beds. But sleep is seldom denied, except to the indolent, and after the day's fatigue, although my bed was nothing more than a sheet spread upon straw, I slept soundly until the morning was considerably advanced. As we prepared our dinner in a place, so filthy that the sight of it alone was sufficient to destroy our appetite, the people of the village collected around us, squalid with dirt, their countenances 24 expressing everything that is disgusting and brutal. They seemed indeed entirely detached from the rest of the world, and ignorant of all that was passing in it. There is much less communication between the various towns of France than in England. The use of passports may easily account for this. These people did not know that Napoleon was deposed, and when we asked why they did not rebuild their cottages, they replied that they were afraid that the Cossacks would destroy them again upon their return. Ecumine, the name of this village, is in every respect the most disgusting place I ever met with. 2 leagues beyond, on the same 25 road, we came to the village of Pavilon, so unlike Ecumine that we might have fancied ourselves in another quarter of the globe. Here everything denoted cleanliness and hospitality. Many of the cottages were destroyed, but the inhabitants were employed in repairing them. What could occasion so great a difference? 28 Vanduvers is a pleasant town, at which we rested during the hours of noon. We walked in the grounds of a nobleman, laid out in the English taste, and terminated in a pretty wood. It was a scene that reminded us of our native country. As we left Vanduvers, the aspect of the country suddenly changed. Abrupt hills, covered with vineyards, intermixed with trees, enclosed a narrow valley, the channel of the Aube. The view was interspersed by green meadows, groves of poplar and white willow, and spires of village churches, which the Cossacks had yet spared. Many villages, ruined by the war, occupied the most romantic spots. In the evening we arrived at Barsarob, 29, a beautiful town, placed at the opening of the vale where the hills terminate abruptly. We climbed the highest of these, but scarce had we reached the top, when a mist descended upon everything, and the rain began to fall. We were wet through before we could reach our inn. It was evening, and the laden clouds made the darkness almost as deep as that of midnight. But in the west, an unusually brilliant and fiery redness occupied an opening in the vapors, and added to the interest of our little expedition. The cottage lights were reflected in the tranquil river, and the dark hills behind, dimly seen, resembled vast and frowning mountains. 30 As we quitted Barsarob, we at the same time bade a short farewell to hills. Passing through the towns of Chaumont, Langurs, which was situated on a hill, and surrounded by ancient fortifications, Champlet and Grey, we traveled for nearly 3 days through plains, where the country gently undulated, and relieved the eye from a perpetual flat without exciting any peculiar interest. Gentle rivers, their banks ornamented by a few trees, stole through these plains, and 1,000 beautiful summer insects skimmed over the streams. The third day was a day of rain, and the first that had taken place during our journey. We were soon wet through, and were 31 glad to stop at a little inn to dry ourselves. The reception we received here was very unprepossessing. The people still kept their seats round the fire, and seemed very unwilling to make way for the dripping guests. In the afternoon, however, the weather became fine, and at about 6 in the evening we entered Besançon. Hills had appeared in the distance during the whole day, and we had advanced gradually towards them, but were unprepared for the scene that broke upon us as we passed the gate of this city. On quitting the walls, the road wound underneath a high precipice. On the other side the hills rose more gradually, and the green valley 32 that intervened between them was watered by a pleasant river. Before us arose an amphitheater of hills covered with vines, but irregular and rocky. The last gate of the town was cut through the precipitous rock that arose on one side, and in that place jutted into the road. This approach to mountain scenery filled us with delight. It was otherwise with our voiturier. He came from the plains of Troyes, and these hills so utterly scared him that he in some degree lost his reason. After winding through the valley, we began to ascend the mountains which were its boundary. We left our voiture and walked on, delighted with every new view that broke upon us. 33 When we had ascended the hills for about a mile and a half, we found our voiturier at the door of a wretched inn, having taken the mule from the voiture, and obstinately determined to remain for the night at this miserable village of Mort. We could only submit, for he was deaf to all we could urge, and to our remonstrances only replied, "Je n'y puis pas." Our beds were too uncomfortable to allow a thought of sleeping in them. We could only procure one room, and our hostess gave us to understand that our voiturier was to occupy the same apartment. It was of little consequence, as we had previously resolved not to enter the beds. The evening was fine, 34, and after the rain the air was perfumed by many delicious scents. We climbed to a rocky seat on the hill that overlooked the village, where we remained until sunset. The night was passed by the kitchen fire in a wretched manner, striving to catch a few moments of sleep, which were denied to us. At 3 in the morning we pursued our journey. Our road led to the summit of the hills that environ Besançon. From the top of one of these, we saw the whole expanse of the valley filled with a white, undulating mist, which was pierced like islands by the piny mountains. The sun had just risen, and a ray of red light lay upon the waves of 35 this fluctuating vapor. To the west, opposite the sun, It seemed driven by the light against the rocks in immense masses of foaming cloud, until it became lost in the distance, mixing its tints with the fleecy sky. Our voiturier insisted on remaining 2 hours at the village of No, although we were unable to procure any dinner, and wished to go on to the next stage. I have already said that the hills scared his senses, and he had become disobliging, sullen, and stupid. While he waited, we walked to the neighboring wood. It was a fine forest, carpeted beautifully with moss, and in various places overhung by rocks, in whose crevices young pines 36 had taken root, and spread their branches for shade to those below. The noon heat was intense, and we were glad to shelter ourselves from it in the shady retreats of this lovely forest. In about 2 hours we arrived at the promised termination of our journey, but the voiturier was not there. After the boy had left him, he again 39 pursued his journey towards Pontelier. We were enabled, however, to procure here a rude kind of cart, and in this manner arrived late at Pontelier, where we found our conductor, who blundered out many falsehoods for excuses, and thus ended the adventures of that day. Switzerland. On passing the French barrier, a surprising difference may be observed between the opposite nations that inhabit either side. The Swiss cottages are much cleaner and neater, and the inhabitants exhibit the same contrast. The Swiss women wear a great deal of white linen, and their whole dress is always perfectly clean. This superior cleanliness is chiefly produced by the difference of religion. Travelers in Germany remark the same contrast between 41 the Protestant and Catholic towns, although they be but a few leagues separate. The scenery of this day's journey was divine, exhibiting piney mountains, barren rocks, and spots of verdure surpassing imagination. After descending for nearly a league between lofty rocks, covered with pines, and interspersed with green glades, where the grass is short and soft and beautifully verdant, we arrived at the village of St. Sulpice. The mule had latterly become very lame, and the man so disobliging, that we determined to engage a horse for the remainder of the way. Our voiturier had anticipated us, without in the 42 least intimating his intention. He had determined to leave us at this village, and taken measures to that effect. The man we now engaged was a Swiss, a cottager of the better class, who was proud of his mountains and his country. Pointing to the glades that were interspersed among the woods, he informed us that they were very beautiful and were excellent pasture, that the cows thrived there, and consequently produced excellent milk, from which the best cheese and butter in the world were made. The mountains after St. Sulpice became loftier and more beautiful. We passed through a narrow valley between two ranges of mountains, clothed with 43 forests, at the bottom of which flowed a river, from whose narrow bed on either side the boundaries of the vale arose precipitously. The road lay about halfway up the mountain, which formed one of the sides, and we saw the overhanging rocks above us and below, enormous pines, and the river, not to be perceived but from its reflection of the light of heaven, far beneath. The mountains of this beautiful ravine are so little asunder, that in time of war with France an iron chain is thrown across it. 2 leagues from Neufchâtel we saw the Alps. Range after range of black mountains are seen extending one before the other, and far behind all, towering above every feature 44 of the scene, the snowy Alps. They were 100 miles distant, but reached so high in the heavens that they look like those accumulated clouds of dazzling white that arrange themselves on the horizon during summer. Their immensity staggers the imagination, and so far surpasses all conception, that it requires an effort of the understanding to believe that they indeed form a part of the earth. From this point we descended to Neufchâtel, which is situated in a narrow plain, between the mountains and its immense lake, and presents no additional aspect of peculiar interest. We remained the following day at this town, occupied in a consideration 45 of the step it would now be advisable for us to take. The money we had brought with us from Paris was nearly exhausted, but we obtained about £38 in silver upon discount from one of the bankers of the city, and with this we resolved to journey towards the Lake of Uri, and seek in that romantic and interesting country some cottage where we might dwell in peace and solitude. Such were our dreams, which we should probably have realized, had it not been for the deficiency of that indispensable article money, which obliged us to return to England. The direction of this lake extends at first from east to west, then turning a right angle, it lies from north to south. This latter part is distinguished in name from the other, and is called the Lake of Uri. The former part is also nearly divided midway, where the jutting land almost meets, and its craggy sides cast a deep shadow on the little strait through which you pass. The summits of several of the mountains that enclose the lake to the south are covered by eternal glaciers, Of one of these, opposite Brunnen, they tell the story of a priest and his mistress, who, flying from persecution, inhabited a cottage at the foot 49 of the snows. One winter night an avalanche overwhelmed them, but their plaintive voices are still heard in stormy nights, calling for succor from the peasants. Brunnen is situated on the northern side of the angle which the lake makes, forming the extremity of the Lake of Lucerne. Here we rested for the night and dismissed our boatmen. Nothing could be more magnificent than the view from this spot. The high mountains encompassed us, darkening the waters. At a distance on the shores of Uri, we could perceive the chapel of Tell, and this was the village where he matured the conspiracy which was to overthrow the tyrant of his country. And in Dethai's lovely lake, these sublime mountains and wild forests seemed a fit cradle for a mind aspiring to high adventure and heroic deeds. Yet we saw no glimpse of his spirit in his present countrymen. The Swiss appeared to us then, and experience has confirmed our opinion, a people slow of comprehension and of action, but habit has made them unfit for slavery, and they would, I have little doubt, make a brave defense against any invader of their freedom. Such were our reflections, and we remained until late in the evening on the shores of the lake conversing, enjoying the rising breeze, and contemplating with feelings of exquisite 51 delight the divine objects that surrounded us. 52 In the meantime, we endeavored to find an habitation, but could only procure 2 unfurnished rooms in an ugly big house, called the Chateau. These we hired at a guinea a month, had beds moved into them, and the next day took possession. But it was a wretched place, with no comfort or convenience. It was with difficulty that we could get any food prepared. As it was cold and rainy, we ordered a fire. They lighted an immense stove which occupied a corner of the room. It was long before it heated, and when hot, the warmth was so unwholesome that we were obliged to throw open our windows to prevent a kind of suffocation. Added to this, there was but 53 one person in Brunnen who could speak French, a barbarous kind of German being the language of this part of Switzerland. It was with difficulty, therefore, that we could get our most ordinary wants supplied. We departed the next morning for the town of Lucerne. It rained violently during the first part of our voyage, but towards its conclusion the sky became clear, and the sunbeams dried and cheered us. We saw again, and for the last time, the rocky shores of this beautiful lake, its verdant isles and snow-capped mountains. 57 The ruse is exceedingly rapid, and we descended several falls, one of more than 8 feet. There is something very delicious in the sensation, when at one moment you are at the top of a fall of water, and before the second has expired, you are at the bottom, still rushing on with the impulse which the descent has given. The waters of the Rhone are blue, those of the Reuss are of a deep green. I should think that there must be something in the beds of these rivers, and that the accidents of the banks and sky cannot alone cause this difference. Sleeping at Dettingen, we arrived the next morning at Leffenburg, where we engaged a small canoe to 58 convey us to Mumph. I give these boats this Indian appellation, as they were of the rudest construction, long, narrow, and flat-bottomed. They consisted merely of straight pieces of deal board, unpainted and nailed together with so little care that the water constantly poured in at the crevices, and the boat perpetually required emptying. The river was rapid, and sped swiftly, breaking as it passed on innumerable rocks just covered by the water. It was a sight of some dread to see our frail boat winding among the eddies of the rocks, which it was death to touch, and when the slightest inclination on one side would instantly have overset it. 59 We could not procure a boat at Mumph, and we thought ourselves lucky in meeting with a return cabriolet to Rheinfelden. But our good fortune was of short duration. About a league from Mumph the cabriolet broke down, and we were obliged to proceed on foot. Fortunately, we were overtaken by some Swiss soldiers, who were discharged and returning home, who carried our box for us as far as Rheinfelden, when we were directed to proceed a league farther to a village, where boats were commonly hired. Here, although not without some difficulty, we procured a boat for Ball, and proceeded down a swift river, while evening came on, and the air 60 was bleak and comfortless. Our voyage was, however, short, and we arrived at the place of our destination by 6 in the evening. Germany. The evening was such as to find few parallels in beauty. As it approached, the banks which had hitherto been flat and uninteresting became exceedingly beautiful. Suddenly the river grew narrow, and the boat dashed with inconceivable rapidity round the base of a rocky hill covered with pines. A ruined tower, with its desolated windows, stood on the summit of another hill that jutted into the river. Beyond, the sunset was illuminating the distant mountains and clouds, casting the reflection of its rich and purple hues on the agitated river. The brilliance and contrasts of the colors on the circling whirlpools of the stream was an appearance entirely new and most beautiful. The shades grew darker as the sun descended below the horizon, and after we had landed, as we walked to our inn round a beautiful bay, the full moon arose with divine splendor, casting its silver light on the before-purpled waves. The following morning we pursued our journey in a slight canoe, in which every motion was accompanied with danger. But the stream had lost much of its rapidity, and was no longer impeded by rocks. The banks were low, and covered with willows. We passed Strasbourg, and the next morning at 64 was proposed to us that we should proceed in the diligence Parrot, as the navigation would become dangerous for our small boat. There were only 4 passengers besides ourselves. 3 of these were students of the Strasbourg University. Schwitz, a rather handsome, good-tempered young man; Hoff, a kind of shapeless animal with a heavy, ugly German face; and Schneider, who was nearly an idiot, and on whom his companions were always playing 1,000 tricks. The remaining passengers were a woman and an infant. The country was uninteresting, but we enjoyed fine weather, and slept in the boat in the open air without any 65 inconvenience. We saw on the shores few objects that called forth our attention, if I except the town of Mannheim, which was strikingly neat and clean. It was situated at about a mile from the river, and the road to it was planted on each side with beautiful acacias. The last part of this voyage was performed close under land, as the wind was so violently against us, that even with all the force of a rapid current in our favor, we were hardly permitted to proceed. We were told, and not without reason, that we ought to congratulate ourselves on having exchanged our canoe for this boat, as the river was now of considerable width, and tossed by the wind into large 66 waves. The same morning a boat, containing 15 persons, in attempting to cross the water, had upset in the middle of the river, and everyone in it perished. We saw the boat turned over, floating down the stream. This was a melancholy sight, yet ludicrously commented on by the batelier, almost the whole stock of whose French consisted in the word sûrement. When we asked him what had happened, he answered, laying particular emphasis on this favorite dissyllable, 100 sûrement un bateau, qui erait sûrement renversé, et tous les pupils sont sûrement noise. Mayence is one of the best fortified towns in Germany. The river, which 67 is broad and rapid, guards it to the east, and the hills for 3 leagues around exhibit signs of fortifications. The town itself is old, the streets narrow, and the houses high. The cathedral and towers of the town still bear marks of the bombardment which took place in the Revolutionary War. We took our place in the diligence Parrot for Cologne, and the next morning, September 4th, departed. This conveyance appeared much more like a mercantile English affair than any we had before seen. It was shaped like a steamboat, with a cabin and a high deck. Most of our companions chose to remain in the cabin. This was fortunate for us, since nothing could be 68 more horribly disgusting than the lower order of smoking, drinking Germans who traveled with us. They swaggered and talked, and what was hideous to English eyes, kissed one another. There were, however, 2 or 3 merchants of a better class, who appeared well-informed and polite. The part of the Rhine down which we now glided is that so beautifully described by Lord Byron in his 3rd canto of Childe Harold. We read these verses with delight, as they conjured before us these lovely scenes with the truth and vividness of painting, and with the exquisite addition of glowing language and a warm imagination. We were carried down by a dangerously 69 rapid current, and saw on either side of us hills covered with vines and trees, craggy cliffs crowned by desolate towers, and wooded islands, where picturesque ruins peeped from behind the foliage, and cast the shadows of their forms on the troubled waters, which distorted, without deforming them. We heard the songs of the vintagers, and if surrounded by disgusting Germans, the sight was not so replete with enjoyment as I now fancy it to have been. Yet memory, taking all the dark shades from the picture, presents this part of the Rhine to my remembrance as the loveliest paradise on earth. We had sufficient leisure for the enjoyment of these scenes, for the boatmen, 70 neither rowing nor steering, suffered us to be carried down by the stream, and the boat turned round and round as it descended. While I speak with disgust of the Germans who traveled with us, I should in justice to these borderers record that at one of the inns here we saw the only pretty woman we met with in the course of our travels. She is what I should conceive to be a truly German beauty, gray eyes, slightly tinged with brown, and expressive of uncommon sweetness and frankness. She had lately recovered from a fever, and this added to the interest of her countenance, by adorning it with an appearance of extreme delicacy. 71 On the following day we left the hills of the Rhine, and found that, for the remainder of our journey, we should move sluggishly through the flats of Holland. The river also winds extremely, so that, after calculating our resources, we resolved to finish our journey in a land diligence. Our water conveyance remained that night at Bonn, and that we might lose no time, we proceeded post the same night to Cologne, where we arrived late. For the rate of traveling in Germany seldom exceeds a mile and a half an hour. Cologne appeared an immense town, as we drove through street after street to arrive at our inn. Before we slept, 72 we secured places in the diligence, which was to depart next morning for Cleves. Nothing in the world can be more wretched than traveling in this German diligence. The coach is clumsy and comfortless, and we proceeded so slowly, stopping so often, that it appeared as if we should never arrive at our journey's end. We were allowed 2 hours for dinner, and 2 more were wasted in the evening while the coach was being changed. We were then requested, as the diligence had a greater demand for places than it could supply, to proceed in a cabriolet which was provided for us. We readily consented, as we hoped to travel faster than in the heavy diligence. But this was not permitted, and we jogged on all night behind this cumbrous machine. In the morning when we stopped, and for a moment indulged a hope that we had arrived at Cleves, which was at the distance of 5 leagues from our last night's stage. But we had only advanced 3 leagues in 7 or 8 hours, and had yet 8 miles to perform. However, we first rested about 3 hours at this stage, where we could not obtain breakfast or any convenience, and at about 8 o'clock we again departed, and with slow, although far from easy traveling, faint with hunger and fatigue, we arrived by noon at Cleves. Holland. Tired by the slow pace of the diligence, we resolved to post the remainder of the way. We had now, however, left Germany, and traveled at about the same rate as an English postchaise. The country was entirely flat, and the roads so sandy that the horses proceeded with difficulty. The only ornaments of this country are the turf fortifications that surround the towns. At Nijmegen we passed the Flying 75 Bridge, mentioned in the letters of Lady Mary Montague. We had intended to travel all night, but at Trial, where we arrived at about 10 o'clock, we were assured that no postboy was to be found who would proceed at so late an hour, on account of the robbers who infested the roads. This was an obvious imposition, but as we could procure neither horses nor driver, we were obliged to sleep here. During the whole of the following day, the road lay between canals, which intersect this country in every direction. The roads were excellent, but the Dutch have contrived as many inconveniences as possible. In our journey of the day before, we had passably a windmill, which was so situated with regard to the road, that it was only by keeping close to the opposite side, and passing quickly, that we could avoid the sweep of its sails. The roads between the canals were only wide enough to admit of one carriage, so that, when we encountered another, we were obliged sometimes to back for half a mile, until we should come to one of the drawbridges which led to the fields, on which one of the cabriolets was rolled, while the other passed. But they have another practice, which is still more annoying. The flax when cut is put to soak under the mud of the canals, and then placed to dry against the trees which are planted on either side of the road. The stench that it exhales, when the beams of the sun draw out the moisture, is scarcely endurable. We saw many enormous frogs and toads in the canals, and the only sight which refreshed the eye by its beauty was the delicious verdure of the fields, where the grass was as rich and green as that of England, an appearance not common on the continent. Rotterdam is remarkably clean. The Dutch even wash the outside brickwork of their houses. We remained here one day, and met with a man in a very unfortunate condition. He had been born in Holland, and had spent so much of his life between England, France, and Germany, that he had acquired a slight knowledge of the language of each country, and spoke all very imperfectly. He said that he understood English best, but he was nearly unable to express himself in that. On the evening of the 8th of August, we sailed from Rotterdam, but contrary winds obliged us to remain nearly 2 days at Marslies, a town about 2 leagues from Rotterdam. Here our last guinea was expended, and we reflected with wonder that we had traveled 800 miles for less than £30, passing through lovely scenes, and enjoying the beauteous Rhine, and all the brilliant shows of earth and sky, perhaps more, traveling 79 as we did in an open boat, than if we had been shut up in a carriage and passed on the road under the hills. The captain of our vessel was an Englishman, and had been a king's pilot. The bar of the Rhine a little below Marslies is so dangerous, that without a very favorable breeze none of the Dutch vessels dare attempt its passage. But although the wind was a very few points in our favor, our captain resolved to sail, and although half repentant before he had accomplished his undertaking, he was glad and proud when, triumphing over the timorous Dutchman, the bar was crossed, and the vessel safe in the open sea. It was in truth an enterprise of some 80 peril. A heavy gale had prevailed during the night, and although it had abated since the morning, the breakers at the bar were still exceedingly high. Through some delay, which had arisen from the ship having got aground in the harbor, we arrived half an hour after the appointed time. The breakers were tremendous, and we were informed that there was the space of only 2 feet between the bottom of the vessel and the sands. The waves, which broke against the sides of the ship with a terrible shock, were quite perpendicular, and even sometimes overhanging in the abrupt smoothness of their sides. Shoals of enormous porpoises were sporting with the utmost 81 composure amidst the troubled waters. We safely passed this danger, and after a navigation unexpectedly short, arrived at Gravesend on the morning of the 13th of September, the third day after our departure from Marseilles. Letters. Letters. Written during a residence of 3 months in the environs of Geneva. In the summer of the year 1816. Letter 1. Hôtel de Secherin, Geneva. May 17, 1816. We arrived at Paris on the 8th of this month, and were detained 2 days for the purpose of obtaining the various signatures necessary to our passports, the French government having become much more circumspect since the escape of Lavalette. We had no letters 86 of introduction, or any friend in that city, and were therefore confined to our hotel, where we were obliged to hire apartments for the week, although when we first arrived we expected to be detained one night only. For in Paris there are no houses where you can be accommodated with apartments by the day. The manners of the French are interesting, although less attractive, at least to Englishmen, than before the last invasion of the Allies. The discontent and sullenness of their minds perpetually betrays itself, nor is it wonderful that they should regard the subjects of a government which fills their country with hostile garrisons, 87, and sustains a detested dynasty on the throne, with an acrimony and indignation of which that government alone is the proper object. This feeling is honorable to the French, and encouraging to all those of every nation in Europe who have a fellow feeling with the oppressed, and who cherish an unconquerable hope that the cause of liberty must at length prevail. Our route after Paris, as far as Troyes, lay through the same uninteresting tract of country which we had traversed on foot nearly 2 years before, but on quitting Troyes we left the road leading to Neufchâtel, to follow that which was to conduct us to Geneva. We entered Dijon on the Thirvening after our departure from Paris, and passing through Dole, arrived at Poligny. This town is built at the foot of Jura, which rises abruptly from a plain of vast extent. The rocks of the mountain overhang the houses. Some difficulty in procuring horses detained us here until the evening closed in, when we proceeded, by the light of a stormy moon, to Champignols, a little village situated in the depth of the mountains. The road was serpentine and exceedingly steep, and was overhung on one side by half-distinguished precipices, whilst the other was a gulf, filled by the darkness of the driving clouds. The dashing of the invisible mountain streams announced to us that we had quitted the plains of France, as we slowly ascended, amidst a violent storm of wind and rain, to Champignols, where we arrived at 12 o'clock, the fourth night after our departure from Paris. The next morning we proceeded, still ascending among the ravines and valleys of the mountain. The scenery perpetually grows more wonderful and sublime, pine forests of impenetrable thickness, and untrodden, nay, inaccessible expanse spread on every side. Sometimes the dark woods descending follow the route into the valleys, the distorted trees struggling with knotted roots between the most barren clefts. Sometimes the road winds high into the regions of frost, and then the forests become scattered, and the branches of the trees are loaded with snow, and half of the enormous pines themselves buried in the wavy drifts. The spring, as the inhabitants informed us, was unusually late, and indeed the cold was excessive. As we ascended the mountains, the same clouds which rained on us in the valleys poured forth large flakes of snow thick and fast. The sun occasionally shone through these showers, and illuminated the magnificent ravines of the mountains, whose gigantic pines were some laden with snow, some wreathed round by the lines of scattered and lingering vapor, others 91 darting their dark spires into the sunny sky, brilliantly clear and azure.